Okay, welcome to what I hope will be an exciting new class. We're going to study a book that most people don't study. Most people have never, I would say, cracked open. It finds itself way, way, way in the back of the Tanakh, which makes it extremely imposing. There's some other parts of the book of Daniel that make it extremely imposing, which is most of it is written in Aramaic. So if you thought Hebrew was hard, then you're really going to have a rough time with Daniel because it's Aramaic. And actually, even if you say, well, I'm okay with Aramaic because I do Gemara, it's a different Aramaic than the Gemara, so it's actually even harder as a result of that. So actually, the book of Daniel is extremely, extremely understudied. Very few people know much about what's in it. Of course, there are some famous stories that get relayed, but actually, as happens even with some of the more famous things, until you look at the details, a lot of times people get it wrong. They're hearing it second and third hand. So we're going to try and look inside and see what it has to say. It's a very important book because it's one of the few books that is different than most of the Tanakh, which takes place in Israel. This is one of the few pieces about a Jewish person, an Israelite, or actually he is a Jewish person, a Judean, who lives outside of Israel and not in the ideal setting of Eretz Israel. So therefore, it's going to be very significant for us to look at what he does well, what he doesn't do well, because that's going to tell us a lot about what it means to be living as a Jew in a foreign land, which we do. Right? We live in the United States of America, and even though it doesn't always feel so foreign to us, it is. It's not Eretz Israel. And I think we're going to find lots of parallels to what Daniel goes through and what we sometimes have to go through here. Some the same, some different. Of course, it's not the only story that works that way. So one of the things that we're going to do is to compare it to some of the more well-known stories that works that way. So what are the two most famous stories that take place with Jews outside of the land of Israel? Feel free to pipe in anytime. What are the two most well-known? Everybody knows them.
Purim.
What's that?
Purim.
Right, Purim. So the book of Esther, right, which has two people actually, at least, Mordechai and Esther, who are not, they don't act exactly the same way. So comparing each of them to Daniel is going to be significant, especially since they're kind of at the same time. So they're only separated by a few years. So we're going to talk about them for sure. And you're going to see lots of comparisons between the book of Daniel and the book of Esther. It's going to jump out at you. But there's another one even more famous, which is often compared to Esther, right? Which is
Yosef.
Right, Yosef. Right, Yosef lives in Egypt, right? So he's outside of the land of Israel. And certainly that's something that's there. You could say Moshe is similar to that. But a little bit less so because he's really almost not even there. So we'll see. But we're gonna try and make comparisons frequently between Yosef and or Esther, Mordechai, and Daniel, and see what they lived, what challenges they faced that was similar, and how they dealt with them. Some ways similar, but actually some ways very different. And of course, always nice to see what the results of different ways that are dealing and what that means. So that's all stuff that we're going to try and look at just as a way of method. Before we really get going, or actually let's just dive right in. It's helpful if you have a Tanakh with you, but I'm going to try and throw things on the screen as possible. What I'll tell you is my method is going to be to try and use the Hebrew for Daniel whenever there's Hebrew, but because the Hebrew is relatively easy. But once it starts going to Aramaic, so we'll just go straight to English. So it's one of the rare cases where you'll see me use an English book to teach Tanakh. But let's get started and go right into it. Book of Daniel, living as a Jew in a foreign land. So one of the first things that you have to do before you actually open the book is you have to understand the context in which it takes place. And before we even talk about the context of Daniel, let's talk about our own context, right? And what is our context, right? So the world that you live in tells you a lot about who you are and what you're experiencing. So if you're telling a story about yourself, it's very important that whoever you're telling it to understands the context in which you live, right? So I'm just going to throw, right, just from my own personal background, right, like what are some contexts that relate to me, right? So first of all, here you have a picture of Aleppo in, I think it's 1850 or so. So that's significant to me in the sense that that's where my great-great-grandfather lived, but quite different than the context that I live in today, right? And then you could look at, New York in 1905 or thereabouts, Lower East Side, right? And that's where my great-grandfather would have lived, and significant to know about me, but very different than where I live. And my parents grew up in New York of the 70s, and that's kind of where I was born, right? And even today, if you're going to do context, right, like you could say we live in New York, right? Well, do you live in 2019 or do you live in 2020, right? And the context changes substantially, right, between these two pictures, right? In 2019, we're living like this, right? And in 2020, we're living like this. And if you tell a story about yourself, so then are we in 2019? Are we in 2020? A huge difference. And so these are things that we take into account. Anytime we're going to talk about anytime we want to talk about a story, we want to know where and when did this story take place. Very, very important to understand the context. Okay, so that's my brief little intro on understanding context. I see people are joining. So just quickly to review, understanding the context of where a story takes place is very, very significant. And that's really what we're going to try and focus on as much as possible today. Because in order to understand the book of Daniel, we have to understand the world, the time of Daniel. And that's what we're going to do. So let's start by looking at the context that the book itself gives us. Okay, and the book itself gives us a very brief context right in the beginning, actually, essentially 2 verses, which tell us a lot of information, but we kind of have to unwrap and unpack that information. That's what we're going to do right now. Okay, so here we go. It says as follows: Bishnat shalosh l'malchut Yehoyakim melech Yehuda, in the 3rd year of the kingdom of Yehoyakim, the king of Yehuda, ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel Yerushalayim vayatzar aleha, came along a different king, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel, to the city of Jerusalem, and vayatzar means he laid siege on it. Right, so we have 2 kings here: King Yehoyakim of Yehuda and King Nebuchadnezzar of Bavel. Yehoyakim is in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar of Bavel comes to Jerusalem and lays siege on Jerusalem. Now, Pasuk Bet says, Vayiten Adonai biyado et Yehoyakim melech Yehuda. Hashem placed in his hand, in the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, Yehoyakim, king of Yehuda. So Yehoyakim is handed over to Nebuchadnezzar, meaning Hashem lets Nebuchadnezzar take Yehoyakim. Umiktzat kle bet Elohim, and not only does he take the king, but he actually takes also utensils from the Bet HaMikdash. By the Eretz Shinar, he brings them to Bavel, Bet Elohav, to the land of his king. Bet HaKelim hevi Bet Otzar Elohav, and he brought the utensils from the Bet HaMikdash to his storehouse, his treasury, the treasury of his gods back in Bavel. Okay, so that's the context, and I'm just gonna kind of open the floor here to you and say, okay, what do we need to know about here? Right? I mean, we've heard of some of these people, maybe not. So if you don't mind, just pipe in and say, who do we need to understand? What do we need to know about in order to understand the times of Daniel? Guys, I don't like lecturing. I like when people participate, if you don't mind. So just pipe in what are the names or items that we need to understand from these people, or from these Pesukim. Who do we need to understand in order to understand the book of Daniel?
Whether we're in the diaspora or where are we with Bet HaMikdash?
Right, so you see the Bet HaMikdash is mentioned, right? In the sense that the utensils of the Bet HaMikdash get taken from the Bet HaMikdash to this other place, Bavel, right? So who are the two names that we see here, right? There's two names that are very, very important.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar is one, right? He's the king of Bavel. And who's the other person that's important?
Yehoiakim.
Right, Yehoiakim. Now notice Daniel is not mentioned yet. We didn't even talk about Daniel. This is before you can understand Daniel. You have to understand the time that he lives in. Kind of like before you could talk about us, right? You would have to talk about, I don't know, Donald Trump or Bibi Netanyahu or you know, Barack Obama or Joe Biden or whoever. In order to understand the time that we live in, you have to understand some people, right? So who are those people? So the two people that you're seeing mentioned are both kings. One is a king of Yehuda, right? Yehuda is what we would call Israel, right? And we're gonna actually look at a map in a second. But Yehuda is the name of what is today, what we would call today Israel. And Bavel is where? Anyone know where Bavel is today?
Iraq.
Iraq, right? So Bavel is modern day Iraq. Of the two kings, just out of curiosity, who have you heard of before of these kings, right? Have you heard of Nebuchadnezzar? Have you heard of Yehoiakim?
Nebuchadnezzar.
You heard of Nebuchadnezzar, right? So he's actually more famous than the Jewish king because he won, right? You know, he succeeded. He took some part of Jerusalem, at least as we see here, and later he's involved in even more, right? So he's a very famous king. He's a world power. I tried searching images of him, but I couldn't find anything on the internet that was an actual image of Nebuchadnezzar. But I did it quickly, so perhaps you can find it on your own. But he is a pretty famous king that was a king of Babylonia, and we're going to see what he accomplished, at least in relation to Yehuda and the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so let's look a little bit. We have to find out who are these guys. Who is Nebuchadnezzar? Who is Yehoiakim? If the book is telling us about them, they must be important. So let's study a little bit. Let's look at who they are. So actually, before you could study Yehoiakim, who is the king, the Jewish king, we actually have to study his father. And his father is Ezra found a Nebuchadnezzar statue. I know I didn't look at it carefully, but good. You know what? Let me see if we could. Let me pull it up 1 second. You put it in the chat. Let's see. Hold on. Let's see if I could get it in. Yeah, that's not a statue of him. Let's see. Yeah, these are all images, not him. Okay.
Is that him as the king with the crown?
I'm sorry, what's that?
There was a photo of him, a statue of a crown, a king with a crown lying in bed.
But it was a photo, not a. If it would have been, you know, shall we say, real, it would have been a stone relief, no pictures survived of him. So whatever pictures you're going to find on the internet are something some artist drew later. Sometimes you can find actual, you know, images of that person. Anyway, not that important.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Rabbi, does the book of Daniel take place after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash?
So that's what we're doing right now. That's what we're going to get to right this second. So in order to understand who Daniel was, you have to understand the time that he lived in. We know Yehoiakim is the king that was mentioned in the book. Yehoiakim is a very short-lived king. To understand him, you have to know about Yoshiahu. Yoshiahu was the father of Yehoiakim. And there's a couple of things that we know about Yoshiahu. First of all, his grandfather is Menashe, who's a terrible king. And during Menashe's time, which he ruled for 52 years, which is a very long time, basically all of Israel was completely dedicated to Avodah Zarah, having nothing to do with Hashem, forgetting Hashem tremendously. When he passes away, Yoshiahu's father rules for a short time, but Yoshiahu becomes the king at 8 years old, which is incredibly young. But even though he was king for 8 years old, he had good advisors and he had good ideas. And essentially, what he tries to do is to return Judea to its glory. And he's pretty successful in expanding its boundaries and making it a significant power, even though he was pretty young. At about 18 years into his rule, so when he's about 26, a very interesting story takes place. it tells us, the Tanakh tells us that a Torah is found in the Bet HaMikdash, which you would think is not an unusual thing. You would think there's a Torah, has many Torah, Sifrei Torah, right? If you were to go to any synagogue in our communities, anywhere around the world, usually you find a number of Sifrei Torah. They had no Sifrei Torah. They found one, and they started reading from it. And when they read from it, they realized, hey, wait a second, we're supposed to be keeping this book. God has certain demands of us. And Yoshiahu, who's this young king, he was 8 in the beginning, but he was 26 at this point, and he's trying to make Judea a significant and substantial kingdom, says, hey, this is why we haven't been successful. It's because we're not following the Torah that was given to our ancestors, because my parents, his grandparents and so on, had basically wiped out Torah from the Jewish people. So he decides to do reforms, and usually when we say reform, we think reform as Orthodox people in our time, we think reform is bad. His reform was actually good. His reforms were to get rid of all the Avodah Zarah and basically to clean up the Bet HaMikdash and kind of restore the belief in one God and Torah, mitzvot, and so on. He does some really nice things, and he's basically trying to do teshuvah and a turnaround for the Jewish people in his time. It was pretty interesting and intriguing. It was like there was no Torah mitzvot virtually, so little that when they found the Torah, they didn't even know what it was. They didn't appreciate it until they started reading it, and then they understood, wow, we are way off. So he started acting upon fixing it, getting rid of the Avodah Zarah and so on. Unfortunately, his head got a little big for his body, and you see in the picture here the town of Megiddo, this was a fortress in northern Israel, and a king from Egypt named Paro Necho was trying to make a battle against Babylonia in the north, and he was passing through Israel. And Yoshiahu didn't want to let him pass through with his army, even though he wasn't trying to hurt Israel in any way. And so he waged a war against him. And in that war, he got killed, which is a terrible tragedy, because would he have stayed out of the war and lived longer, which he had plenty of years left to live, who knows what he might have done. He might have turned things around, and the first Bet HaMikdash might not have been destroyed if this would have happened. So all this is happening at the tail end of the first Bet HaMikdash. And this good king, Yoshiahu, gets killed by Paro Necho, the king of Egypt. Now, he has 2 sons, Yoshiahu does. One is named Yehoachaz, and the other is named Eliakim. They are sons from different mothers. They each kind of wanted to be the king. And as often happens, there's a little bit of a struggle. And the Tanakh tells us about that struggle. Yeah, I'm going to go to that right now. So this is the Book of Kings, and it talks about what happened when Yoshiahu dies. So this is the Book of Kings, Book 2, chapter 23, and it says as follows: Ben esrim v'shalosh shana, on the 23rd year, Yehoachaz b'melcho. Yehoachaz was the king. U'shlosha chodashim alach b'Yerushalayim. So Yehoachaz becomes the king. He rules for 3 years. B'shem imo Chamutal bat Yirmiyahu Melivna, that's his mother's name, only to tell us that they have different mothers. Vayas hara b'nei Hashem, he didn't do what Hashem wanted. Kechol asher asu avotav, he did like the forefathers that were not good. And so although he ruled for only 3 months, he was not a good king like his father. Vayasreu Paro Necho b'rivla b'eretz Chamat mimloch Yerushalayim. And what happens? The king of Egypt, Paro Necho, who killed his father, comes and takes him and puts him in jail. And charges Bnei Yisrael with a tax, a heavy tax. So in order to understand what we've been talking about, I want to go back to this map. And this is a map of the Middle East, which I hope is clear on your screens. And if you notice, Israel, right, which is right in the middle over here, right where this arrow is pointing to, is kind of in the middle of all the major world powers that take place at different times. So the yellow would be Egypt, the orange would be Babylonia, the blue would be Assyria, and so on. And what happens is that because Israel ends up being in the middle of Egypt and Babylonia, or Egypt and Assyria, what will often happen in Israel is that foreign armies will try and pass through, or armies will try and take Israel itself in order to use it as a buffer against one of the other peoples. So Israel is in this hot zone, and it's continually a place of war and battles and armies passing through, and therefore it's politically hot, militarily hot, and things are always happening there. It probably not by chance that Hashem placed Israel right in that spot, because we're at the crossroads of the world. Right? I showed you a picture of Times Square before, which is often referred to as the crossroads of civilization. But the truth is, Israel is really the crossroads of ancient civilization, because in order to get anywhere, you had to go through Israel. If you wanted to go from Europe, Africa, Asia, you had to go through Israel, and that made it a very, very significant place of land. So what was happening was Paro was coming up to go attack Bavel, or Bavel would be coming down to attack Jerusalem. So what was happening was Israel was constantly in the middle of these different struggles, these politics, these battles. And therefore, it made it a very, very hot zone and significant place. Okay, so what we're saying, just to quickly review what we've said until this point. So first of all, we have, we're trying to understand the context that Daniel lived in. There was a great king, Yoshiahu, but he died tragically and too quickly. He left two sons. One took over, but ruled for only 30 days, for 3 months. And then the Egyptians, right, who we said were coming from the south, came and they basically took that king, put him in jail, and put a tax on the people. And what did they do instead? They weren't going to leave no one there. So look at Pasuk Lamed Daled here, and it says, "Vayamlech Paro necho et Eliakim ben Yoshiahu tachat Yoshiahu aviv." So King Paro wants to have some kind of rulership in Israel, in Judea. So what does he do? He takes the other son, Eliakim, son of Yoshiahu, and he places him as king. Vayasevet Shemo Yehoyakim. He changes his name to be Yehoyakim, and that name should be familiar because that's the first king mentioned in the book of Daniel. He took the brother and he brought him to Egypt, put him in jail, killed him there. And gold and silver, Yehoyakim, who was placed as king by Paro, he paid the tax. They placed a heavy tax on the people. The people had to pay taxes to Paro because Paro made the king of Judea. He was 25 years old. He ruled for 11 years, and his mother was different than the mother of Yoachaz, just to tell us. So he also did bad. So even though he was different than his brother because he was appointed by the Egyptian king, he wasn't different in the fact that he wasn't loyal to Hashem. He was unlike his father, who was loyal to Hashem. Okay, so it's pretty crazy story here, right? That we have all these turnovers, and then what happens to him? So we go back to that map before, right? And just look at this map, right? So the map over here says Egypt came. They were coming to attack Babylon, right? So they were going from south to north, or from west to east, and they came through Israel, and they took over they killed the king that was here. They killed his son also, and then they took another son and they made him the king. So what's happened? This has become Egyptian, right? This has become under Egyptian rule, right? Israel's become under Egyptian rule. But of course, when that's going to happen, this new empire, Babylonia, which is growing, says, hey, we don't want Egypt to control this piece of land. We're going to come. So what ends up happening? When Yehoyakim is made king, so it says, Biyamav ala Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. So he goes and he is going to attack Jerusalem. Vahilo Yehoyakim eved shalosh shanim. And he takes Yehoyakim, who was set up to be king by the Egyptians, and he says, hey, you're going to now serve me. I'm more powerful than the Egyptians. And he basically makes him a servant for 3 years, which basically means he made him pay taxes to him. But what happens? Yehoiakim says, hey, I don't want to pay you taxes. And he calls the Egyptians and says, Egyptians, help me out. And he rebels against the Babylonians. But the Babylonians are stronger. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? By Shalach bo Hashem et bo kedudeh kasdim et kedudeh Aram et kedudeh Moav et kedudeh Ben Ammon by Shalachem Yehuda la'avido kevar Hashem asher diber b'yad avadav hanevim. Hashem, it says, gives Nebuchadnezzar the power to take all these foreign armies and come to Jerusalem. Ach al pi Hashem hayta b'Yehuda l'asrim al panav v'chatom asher. All the bad things that would happen to Jerusalem were coming from Hashem. It says that Yehoiakim killed innocent people here. He filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and it says, instead of Yehoiakim being the king, instead Bavel, he makes a new king, and that king is Yehoiachin, and Egypt no longer has control over Israel. So, a quick review of all the things that we said so far, and I know it's a lot and a lot to keep track of. But basically, what we saw happen was there was a good king that tried to reform Israel and make everyone follow Hashem. That king overreached, got killed. He had 2 sons. One was appointed as a follow-up, but the Egyptians who killed the father were not interested in this king, so they killed him too. And they appointed another king, and that king is Yehoiakim. That king is then attacked from the north by Babylonia, and that really brings us to what happened in the book of Daniel, right? And what happened in the book of Daniel, just going to go back and share that for 1 second, right? What happened in the book of Daniel is the first 2 Pesukim, right? Which is in the 3rd year of Yehoiakim's rule, right? Bishnat shalosh malchut Yehoiakim melech Yehuda, ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel Yerushalayim yatzar aleha. He comes and he lays siege on Jerusalem, and Hashem puts Yehoiakim in his hands, and he takes the Beit HaMikdash down. Right, and he takes the utensils with him. The question that I ask is, okay, what can we say about the world that Daniel lives in, right? And that's the real question that we want to talk about, which is, so we're going to study the book of Daniel. What world is Daniel living in? What can we say about what we saw so far today? Chaotic, right? The number one thing that you want to say is chaotic, which maybe we can relate to, right? I don't want to bring too much into modern times, say, because it's different than modern times, right? But a little bit chaotic, right? The time that we're living in does feel chaotic because of the changes that are happening in the world around us. What rules do we have to follow? Who do we have to go by? When we looked at the picture of Times Square, right? Was Times Square 2019 or 2020? Right? Very, very upside down. A lot of upheaval, and that creates difficulty, right? A big amount of difficulty. So the first thing I think that we definitely want to say about the time of Daniel that he lived in was that it was chaotic, for sure. Good. In what way is chaotic? Let's also talk about that. Right. What is some of the chaos that we saw?
Rabbi,
yeah.
Who wrote the book of Daniel?
So great question. Who wrote the book of Daniel? It's probably Daniel, right? It's probably by him, because that's really it's one of the latest books in the Tanakh, so it's probably written by him or one of his contemporaries. Otherwise, it wouldn't find its way into the Tanakh. It's one of the latest books. So it's kind of a first or second hand account, which we're going to see makes sense when we start reading it, that's the case. So that's certainly an important detail of who wrote it, but actually still a little less important than what's happening in the times, right? So certainly the chaos that's happening. So where is there chaos? There's political chaos, right? Which is, who's in charge, right? So that's definitely part of the chaos. But there's other types of chaos that we might have picked up on. What other chaos was happening? What other changes did you see? There were at least 2 other changes that would have happened. Right? So one change that was very significant is religious change. Right? If you noticed, right, we talked about Yoshiahu was a king that tried to make the Jewish people more religious. But then his children came and they were bad. And then Nebuchadnezzar is coming and he's taking the religious items and bringing them into his temples and his religious places. So there's actually a lot of religious upheaval, not only political upheaval. So I think that's very, very significant. Because if there's political upheaval, they say, okay, that's in the world of politics. But when there's also religious upheaval on top of the political upheaval, so then that takes an area that could potentially be a stability and a stabilization for people, and it eliminates it because you don't really know where you stand. Yeah, Audrey, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. So at that time, if I remember the history, were the Jewish people putting up putting up like little Bet HaMikdash, I would say, I don't know, up north in their little areas, in many little towns. They were
right,
putting up.
You're remembering very well. It's actually a little bit before this that happened.
Okay.
So you're talking about right after Shlomo, right? Right after Shlomo,
Right.
there's a split between the northern and southern kingdoms.
Yes.
And in order to make the northern kingdom, which is Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom, which is Judea, to be able to have its own religion, so they do set up like kind of other types of Bet HaMikdash. But those people basically got wiped off the map within 200 years. And what we're talking about is after that, and the king Yoshiahu that we were talking about, the good king, he was trying to take what was left of the southern kingdom and expand it north to restore it almost. And he was succeeding, except that he overreached. And then instead of taking, he took 2 steps forward and then about 8 back. And so therefore, again, I didn't start the story from where you started, but the truth is, what you're saying only points to the fact that there was this continual religious upheaval, this continual lack of like, hey, what are we supposed to do, right? Which makes life extremely challenging. There was one other upheaval. So we had political, we had religious, but there's another upheaval that's very, very significant, which is geographic. Right, which is Bnei Israel was in Jerusalem at the start of the story, but at least some segment, the king and the utensils, and what we're going to see is also some high-level people were also exiled to Babylonia, right? So if they're exiled to Babylonia, so not only do you have religious upheaval, political upheaval, you have geographic upheaval. When you don't know your place, when you don't know where you are, right? That's extremely difficult, extremely challenging, right? Imagine you had to pick up and move to, Waco, Texas, right? Or you had to pick up and move to, Soweto, South Africa, right? Or something like that. It's just wow, it's crazy, and so that's really. The key thing to understand about the book of Daniel is everything that we're going to read happens in this time of upheaval, of chaos, of uncertainty. And that makes it extremely, extremely important because Jews have lived through these types of times a lot. And we've had to live in these types of times. So the book of Daniel will have lots of really good insight and perspective for us on how to navigate that type of time, that type of living. And it's a challenging one, much more challenging than the stable one of living in the land of Israel and owning a farm and going through seasons and you know what to expect. That was the ideal living that the Torah had. The reality of what we've had to live through historically is a lot closer to this brief description that we have of the book of Daniel, the context that we're seeing. And that's really what we're going to have to build off of. And so that's what we're going to start with next week, is we're going to say, okay, so now our heads are ready to strap in to understand Daniel's words. If we didn't understand what we just went through, then even if certain things make sense, it doesn't really make sense. You need to appreciate the political, religious, and geographic upheaval of the times to fully appreciate the chaos, the uncertainty, the instability that he would have lived through in order to make his words all that more meaningful. His experience is that much more powerful. So that's what we're going to study. That's what we're going to look at next time. 12 o'clock next week, same bad time, same bad channel. Any questions, anyone? Anything anyone want to contribute, please? Okay. Take care.
Bye, Rabbi. Thank you.